Use Tom Doran, and his presentation is named, Thinking Through Styling and, this is so long, Styling and Layout of Classes, Modules, and Defined Resources. Please enjoy.
Cool. Hey, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yep, sounds good from here. Awesome. So, at work, traditionally our Puppet code has been awful. Really, really, really terribly bad. And we also, for years, didn't upgrade Puppet to a new version, so we were running Puppet 0.25 for a very, very long time. And about 6 months ago, we started fixing that. And so in the last 6 months, I've actually done quite a lot of talking and emailing and writing documents to people about how we should structure Puppet code, and as we upgrade, how we write code that's compatible with the new features that are going to come in as we upgrade Puppet. And I just kind of wanted to run through some of the things that I've explained to people at work with you, because I mean, hopefully this might help some people. So this is a topic. There's already actually lots of great material. If you go on Google, there's lots and lots and lots of talks about writing reusable Puppet code. Certainly Puppet Camp this year and a load of the Puppet events have had really good talks about this stuff. So a lot of this is actually covering ground that you can find online. Sorry about that, but I've kind of found that going through all of this, it actually still takes a bunch of effort to understand. Certainly if you're looking at your Puppet code and you're trying to work out, well, should I make it like this Forge module or this Forge module, or which one of them is better or crazy? There's kind of more than one right way to do it, which is fine, but it's not that simple. And certainly if you're looking at a mess and trying to work out how to make it better, it's definitely not that simple. So the first rule is, if we're talking about your Puppet code for work, keep it simple, right? Because if your colleagues have to read this and understand this, simpler is better. People who can only the people that you work with who aren't at the event here today are going to have to read your code and understand your code and be able to write your code. So keeping it simple will help them. One of the big things I'm going to talk about quite a lot is getting data out of your manifests. You should split data and code apart, because that makes things a lot more maintainable and understandable and flexible later. And follow conventions. So there's a really good Puppet style guide online if you haven't seen it. But what I more mean about this is work out some conventions for how you write things in your workplace and actually document them and make your code try and stick to them, because then you can point to, we did it like this because this is how we do it, and it's documented why we do it like this. So keeping it simple and following conventions will really help you out. So the first thing to start with is modules only. Who has bunches of Puppet code in their work code base that isn't in modules? Excellent, that's only me. Wonderful. I'll go through this quickly then. There's a bunch of advantages to using modules. The key one for me being modules work with environments. So you can push different environments out to your Puppet master for testing code, and that's really handy until you have code that isn't in modules, at which point you make a change, you push it out to an environment, you try and run it, and nothing happens, and you spend half an hour being really, really confused about that. And the other thing about modules is that there's higher level reuse patterns for how you combine modules sensibly together, which we'll come back to. Another kind of guideline for writing a code is try and keep it simple, but try and keep it flexible, because you don't know who's going to be using the code that you've written or how they're going to want to use it. This is especially important if you want to ship something to Puppet Forge. One of the most irritating things I find is when I find a module on Puppet Forge that's almost but not quite perfect, and say maybe I don't want to manage the service with Upstart and it's using Upstart, and there's no way to turn it off. And I get really mad because there's all this code, 90% of which I totally want to steal, and 10% of which I can't use, and the fact that someone has written it to absolutely have to use Upstart means that I can't do anything. But to say again, for your own modules in your own work code base, keeping it simple is probably better than having a billion parameters. Because if it's your code in your work code base, you can go and change it and you can go and add more parameters. If you're shipping it to the Forge, it should have a million parameters for everything from the word go, because that helps other people reuse it. If it's your own work code, then, well, you can just iterate on that really easily. And the kind of two key things that I found when looking at Forge modules is allow the package install to be overridden. I mean, in the default case, you probably want to manage the package for people if they're using one of the operating systems that you are. But if they're using some crazy operating system that you aren't, allow them to have that freedom and allow them to manage the package themselves. On the same note, allow people to not manage the service. For example, I've been doing a load of stuff with Docker. And so any Puppet module that is trying to activate services that I'm trying to drop into a Docker container, well, that's really bad because I'm not running Upstart inside the Docker containers whilst I'm building them. And this causes explosions and sadness and pain, and I have to fork your module and cry a bit. The other thing is don't manage users in your modules. As soon as you start adding users in your modules, you're just building a massive bunch of pain. Keep your user management outside your reusable modules. Okay, everybody good with that? Cool. So let's talk about Puppet versions. So who's still running Puppet 0 point something? Sir, upgrade. Sorry. Who's still running Puppet 2.7? I'm doing this at work. I've also got home Puppet stuff that I'll kind of mention a bit where I have upgraded. So Puppet 2.7 over Puppet 0 point anything. The key introduction was parameterized classes. And those make your life a whole bunch easier. The key killer thing with Puppet 2.7 code is dynamic scope. And in fact, Puppet 3, who's running Puppet 3.0? Okay, so most people are on Puppet 3-ish at the moment. The key killer is that this doesn't have any dynamic scope. So if you're using dynamic scope, then basically your code will break when you upgrade. And the main thing certainly that I'm going to talk about today in Puppet 3 is data bindings. So you automatically get Hira, and Hira variables get automatically interpolated into parameters in your classes. Okay, so who's running Puppet 3.3 or above? A few people. I'm doing this in my home Puppet code. Who's using Hira data in modules? Oh, the same people. Wow, that's actually impressive. You guys are over the curve of adoption. Most people aren't doing this yet. I'd be interested to talk to people later to find out how this is working for them. So dynamic scope. This, if you're not aware, is dynamic scope. So the $bar variable there, we're just relying on that to kind of get magically passed into foobar. And yeah, this won't work in Puppet 3. So anybody who's on Puppet 2.7, you're going to have to fix all these things. And what does fixed look like? Well, you just pass an extra parameter down. Just this line here is passing the extra parameter. Cool. So data binding. I said that's one of the most powerful features. You can still do this in Puppet 2.7. In fact, if you write code like this, then this code is completely forwards compatible to Puppet 3, as in it'll work exactly the same. And after Puppet 3, you can just change it to be that. But there's no harm in having the equals here part there. Just Puppet 3 automatically adds this behavior for everything. So certainly if you're shipping code to the Forge and you want it to use Hira, then you should be writing it like the top example, because then people who are using Puppet 2.7 can use it. If you're on Puppet 2.7 and you want to use Hira, you should be doing it like this, because then you can upgrade to Puppet 3 and just delete code but not make any significant changes, and you can delete the code whenever. Okay, cool. So who knows about ARM9? Well, there's a couple of people. I googled for ARM9. I thought that was a good image. 9-armed octopus. There you go. Things you find on Google. Awesome. So ARM9 it is hero data in modules. And I know more people said that they were using it than know about ARM9. So I'm a little scared because most of the documentation for this is in ARM9. So how you're using it without having read the documentation, I'm slightly confused about. OK, so to cover this feature for the people who haven't read ARM9 and kind of aren't using this yet, in Puppet 3.3 plus, for your foo module, you can make a data directory, and then you can put hero data in to your data directory, kind of like this. So, for example, you've got a common YAML, and you can actually specify whatever hero hierarchy you like, because inside your module, you can embed a hero.yaml, and that says, I want a hierarchy of operating system and common, as a simple example. And this is pretty awesome, because it means that you can ship the data in your modules as data, rather than in the manifests. And actually, it turns out that this is quite a good feature. I mean, much like the Puppet 2.7, Puppet 3 data bindings thing, if you've designed your stuff right, you can pretty much just upgrade to this. And as soon as you're upgraded to Puppet 3.3, you can then start moving your hero data into your modules where it makes more sense. But up until that point, you kind of don't need to stress about this. OK, so I'm going to kind of spin back a bit and talk about designing Puppet code. So we'll start with the simplest abstraction, or the simplest chunk of things. So who knows about this pattern? OK, so if I show you this, who knows about this sort of pattern? OK, that's a load more people. So one of the most common things that you end up doing when you write a new Puppet module is you want a package to be installed, you want to provide some config for that package, and then there's probably a service that you want to start that reads that config and does things. And so all of my Puppet code kind of used to look like this at work, which is great because it tries to start the service and then tries to write the config file for in a directory that doesn't exist, and then tries to install the package, which is wonderful. Or any other order of Puppet feels like. So the easy solution to this is to use metaparameters. Who's seen things like this before? OK, cool. That's well known to everybody, seemingly, most people. I like this sort of pattern better, actually. So actually, I split everything up into individual classes. So there'll be an install class, and in a simple case, that just contains the package. It'll be a config class, and in a simple case, that just has the one config file. And there'll be a service class, and that just contains a service. And the nice thing about this is that you can actually put the metaparameters on the entire class. So if you add extra config files later, then you get nice stuff happening. As in your extra config, your extra package or your extra services will all automatically get notified. If you had a second service down here, then that will also get notified if the config changes. So kind of pulling the abstraction up from I want to notify on this file or this service to I want to notify on this entire class is actually really nice and a lot more flexible. Cool. So the next kind of golden hard rule for writing Puppet code well is every module should have exactly one entry point. If you have more than one entry point, or if your entry point, if the thing you do isn't include foo, then you're doing it wrong, basically. I don't care if your module manages both a server and a client. If you don't have one entry point, you're doing it wrong. Because as soon as you look at a new Puppet module, you expect to open up init.pp and start exploring from there. So just for I'm reading your code reasons, it should be init.pp. That's where I should be able to start exploring from there. I should be able to start looking, and it should make sense. And saying that, well, OK, so if I look at your Puppet module I've never seen before, I'm going to open init.pp to start with. Actually, I recommend, rather than using metaparameters, that you externalize your dependencies. So who's seen the weird arrow things here before? OK, a decent range of people. People who haven't seen these, this arrow is ordering, and this arrow is notification. So this is exactly the same as the code that I was showing you a couple of slides back. So the requires was the arrow, and the notifies the squiggly arrow, and except for the fact that this is at the top level, and as I mistakenly said before, if I added an extra config file here, then I'd have to have the requires and the notify a second time. And I'd have to remember to do that, and I'm rubbish at remembering things. So if I put it here, it's obvious. As soon as I crack the init.pp and look at it, I can see all the modules and how they're interrelated. And also, it means that if I add things to any of these modules, then they automatically get the relationships. I don't need to remember method parameters at the low level anyway. Does that make sense, everybody? Blank looks. Good. No sense at all. So let's talk about parameters. This is the original traditional way to do parameters. And this, who's seen a colon params class before? A reasonable number of people. So this is basically a trick. And so the trick is that what we want is to be able to work out the package name conditionally based upon operating system. But we want to be able to do that before having called class foo. So what we do is we put all the logic in here, and that's kind of nice because you've got this one class called params, and you know that that's going to have all the parameters in it. Or at least, if you have a class called params and it doesn't have all the parameters in it, you're probably doing it wrong. And then the inherits at the top of the slide, that means that foo params gets evaluated before foo, and you can then use the variables in there as defaults. So this is showing my kind of, one of the preferred patterns, and this works pretty well. Of course, if you're using 2.7, you can also add in a hero lookup if you want to. In 3.0, you don't need to. It just looks like that. And that's pretty cool, but I'm not keen on that params class thing. I mean, it's the way that you have to do it if you're shipping a module to the Forge, pretty much, because you can't rely that people on the Forge are running latest Puppet. You can't, well, you can document, please put all of these things in your hero data, but people won't really like you very much for doing that. So, but if you're just talking about in your work code, well, I'd actually just skip the params class, and I would just stick things in hero data. So, for example, you could do this. So what this does is it will find a package name from hero data based upon your operating system, or it'll find a default package name, or if it's not there, return false. So this shows my preferred pattern of if you can override this to explicitly false, and that means the package won't be installed. And that's great if you want to use it on, say, FreeBSD, and you want to manage the package in some completely different way. But this kind of relies on the fact that you can stick things in your common.pp. Well, actually, if your hierarchy already includes the operating system, well, you don't need kind of any of this conditional complexity. You could just use foo : package name, and that's great. But yeah, if it's a Forge module, this just doesn't work so well, or doesn't work at all, really. With Puppet 3.3, well, you've got data in modules. So actually, we don't need any of this complicated stuff at all, and we just end up back here, right? Because you can just ship the variants of the data around with your module. And that's awesome, because I don't like param classes. I mean, they work, they solve the problem, but it's a piece of code that contains only data and only conditionals on data, and that is what Hiro is good for. Okay, cool. So next, I'm going to talk about some of the tools that you should use when building modules, or in fact, the tool. Who's heard of stdlib? Okay, that's about 80% of the room. The 20% of the room that hasn't, please go and check this out. This has it's basically a library of a bunch of functions that you absolutely must use. If you're not using at least some of these functions, then you're completely doing it wrong. Or at least I will break your Puppet code as soon as I come across it. Well, no, because seriously, who remembers? Who remembers whether true needs to be quoted or not for this module? You do. OK, good. You clearly have more space in your brain than me, or you're managing less code than I am. Because module A might need true quoted. Module B needs it not quoted. That sounds brilliant. No. No. So actually, if it's a Boolean, and it's going to be true or false, you should be using str to bool for every single parameter of every class, every time you pull anything in from hero data. And I'm just kind of showing you the trivial example. In YAML, you can actually have a proper true value that isn't the string true. If you use anything else, if you start pulling hero data from LDAP or from somewhere else, then you might not even have Booleans. You might have to pass in string true. So just use this. On the same note, things that will make me cry, not using this. If you ever have code that takes an array of parameters, please, 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 please use any to array on it, because that means that I can pass a single value rather than having to remember to pass an array. The canonical example being ports. If I have a web server module and it has ports, I want to be able to just pass port arrow 80 and have that work. I want to be able to pass port arrow brackets 8443, have that work too. Because otherwise I'm going to get this wrong and cry and have to open your code and work out what you... And it's really simple to do, so why would you not do that to avoid people crying? OK, so another couple of things from stdlib. A couple of the things you can do is if you really need to install a package, or you really need to depend upon something else for your module to run, but also you don't want to pull in that package so that because some other module might want to override it or do something different or manage it itself, there's an ensure packages function. So rather than declaring a package, that will check if it's already declared. If it's already declared, great. If it isn't declared, it'll declare it. And there's a more generic version of that called ensure resource, which will do this for any resource. So if you're trying to deal with I have module foo that needs things from module bar, and module bar may or may not be present, who's ended up with if define class so-and-so do something otherwise? Yeah, quite. Not all the cases of that can be eliminated, but a whole chunk of them just go away with ensure resource. And it's generally clearer and much nicer if not defined in your manifests. Cool. So, how much time have I got left? Some. Cool. Loads. Excellent. OK, so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of toolkit modules. And this is where it becomes kind of non-trivial. When you've got a class and maybe a define, then it's all relatively simple and you can see how things fit together. When you have toolkit modules like Nginx, vhost, Docker, run, etc., this is the define that you're going to call multiple times from multiple places. And it can get really, really complicated. Right. And one of the other things I'm going to recommend is if you ship defines like this in your module, consider putting something like that code in as well. Because certainly when I'm playing with your module for the first time and prototyping with it, I don't want to have to write a load of code. So actually just being able to create who knows about this create resources function? Okay, some people. Okay, so the create resources function, what you do is basically you pass it an array of hashes, and it'll go and call the define. This will call the foo bar define once for every bar that it finds. And this is really, really useful. It's really useful when you're writing complicated code. It's really useful to just drop in your modules so that people can set up defines from hero data when they're prototyping, because it means you don't need to write any code. it's just generally handy. I'd really like if everybody did this in their top-level modules for all their defines. I don't necessarily, this isn't the only way that I use defines, but having it there is dead handy. And if you don't, I'll just end up putting it in anyway in a higher-level module. So do that. And this is where it gets pretty complicated. Multiple instances. Who's written a Puppet module and been pretty happy with it, and then found that they need multiple instances of whatever? And let's pick Nginx. You might want one Nginx to listen on your front network interface, one to listen on your back network interface. You might want different ones for different ports, etc. Yeah, this gets really hard really quickly. Who's come across this problem? Okay, whole bunch of people. So when you want one Puppet module to manage multiple of the same thing, so yeah, multiple Nginx, multiple copies of the same Nginx, this gets pretty complex pretty fast. But with just a few kind of simple rules and some thought, you can manage that complexity somewhat. So if you remember that by default, this is the way that Puppet works. You can quite easily arrange for it to not work like this, but don't. So if you have code and you call a class or you call a define, that should always, 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 always override anything that came out of here, because doing anything else is not what Puppet does in a standard way, and it's just going to confuse and hurt people. And then if you have multiple instances for something, say you have Nginx A and Nginx B, or foo A and foo B, I would put default parameters just under the main namespace of the module, because one of the challenges when you have multiple instances of something is whether to override or how to override things between the two different instances, and also how to share things between the two different instances. So what I'm going to recommend is that you arrange things like this. You have defaults in like foo bar, and then you have a hierarchy called foo : instance, whatever your instance name is, bar. And that means you can keep all the defaults in the completely obvious place that would be the same place as if you only had one instance. And that means that you can have a class that supports multiple instances, but then if you just use it in a simple way, like include foo, it will work for one instance and it will work for one instance in the way that you expect. So this, again, if you're shipping a module to the Forge, this is definitely how to do it, because it means that users who only want one Nginx don't have to jump through hoops just due to the fact that you support having 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And it means that if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 that are mostly similar except for a couple of settings, then you only have to override those couple of settings. I actually use this sort of pattern a lot in work. I mean, examples of things that we do is we have multiple postfix servers because we send high priority email, medium priority email, low priority email. You know, if someone orders takeaway, you definitely need to send them their receipt. If we're just sending marketing spam, well, it doesn't matter if it's 6 hours late. No, really, it doesn't, because we send millions of those. So no, I have several different postfixes running on the same machine, and the only real difference is the port that they're listening to and the priority level. So that's only 2 or 3 settings in postfix, but the rest of the config for postfix is completely custom. So I have that in one place, and then just the slow instance gets a couple of parameters overridden, and just the fast instance gets a couple of parameters overridden. Okay, so here's where it gets really fun. If you have a module that supports multiple instances, that's also a toolkit. I mean, Nginx is a perfect example of this, a perfect example for this. You can have multiple Nginx instances, each of which can have multiple vhosts. And how you manage this in a way that all the default data can be one place and you don't have to repeat yourself 9 times can get pretty complicated. Except, again, stdlib to the rescue. It has this lovely little function called getParam, and that means that I can pass a top-level param in foo, and oh, I've got a typo here. This should be colon, colon, something else. That means I can pass the top-level param in foo. No, I can pass the top-level bar parameter, and then somewhere else, I can go and get that parameter back. So that means that when you have a vhost attached to Nginx instance A, it can go and get the default port for Nginx instance A. So you can basically retrieve variables across namespaces that are in other defines. Because which Nginx instances you have, instance A and instance B, you're going to call the define for A and set some default parameters for A. You're going to call the define for B, set some default parameters for B. But then when you have a vhost attached to A, it needs to go and retrieve parameters from that define you previously called. That's the getParam function. Pretty handy. A combination of getParam and ensure resource is pretty much your friend. So how does it actually look? I'm kind of trying to fit these examples on slides was kind of difficult. So if the previous slide didn't explain anything, this definitely won't. But no, being serious, this is like an actual kind of example of how this would look. So I've got an Nginx class at the top level. It has some default data. It has a number of instances. And by default, you just have a default instance. And then you have an Nginx instance define, which gets called a number of times. And again, I'm using the Hira instance name pattern. I'm using entity array. I'm working out a base path. So all the config files that I write out for each Nginx instance need to be under a different place in the file system. So the way that this works is when at the bottom I define an Nginx vhost, that then goes and looks up what the base file system, set Nginx default. It goes and looks that up from the other define, and then I can define files under the right base path, and kind of everything hangs together. So you can have this Nginx vhost define that you just pass which Nginx this vhost belongs to into it. It all works quite nicely. I'm going to put these slides online later so you can actually kind of look at the code, and you can tweet me with all the places I made mistakes. So who's heard of this? Roles and profiles. It's about 30% of you. Okay, so who has had, people who didn't put their hands up, who has nodes that have 10 plus modules included in them? Right. And then, so say that's your web server. How do you tell what the difference between a web server and a test web server is? Well, maybe you add GDB and a couple of testing tools. Just looking at the node manifests, it's really hard to work out. Well, the only thing that's really going to help you is how you name your hosts. But then if you have 4 figures of hosts, that gets pretty hard too. What really is test DB27R58 SFO1? No, really, what the hell does that mean? It's a database, sure, but what the hell does that database do? I have dozens of database servers. That doesn't mean much. So the way that roles and profiles works is it allows you to do a high-level classification. So a role is basically a node classifier. So every machine will have exactly one role. No more, no less, exactly one role. So, for example, it's a web server, right? And that very obvious. You have, node web 47, include role web server. Job done. It's completely obvious what this machine does. Totally obvious. But then, so then the way that a role does this is that you look inside a role and it contains a number of profiles. And the profiles are what actually use Hira data, and they then use multiple modules below that. So for example, profile Apache. So a web server, might run Apache and Tomcat and some stuff to archive logs up into S3 and a bunch of other stuff. We can just say role web server, and that contains profile Apache and profile Tomcat, and so you kind of split things down. Okay, and then an individual module that isn't a role or a profile should be a single concern. So the Apache module, for example, The Apache module should not deal with shipping your logs to S3. If it does, you're doing it wrong. Which is why you have a profile Apache module, and the profile Apache module can pull in the Apache module and the ship logs to S3 module. And you have 3 levels, and it makes sense suddenly. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? No. Excellent. Well, in the slides speaker notes, I've actually put in, there's a load of URLs where people talk about this, and Puppet Labs have just published a video training course. It's only 10 minutes long on this, and it's actually really, really good. So that's linked in the slides if you want to check this out some more. And the other nice thing in profiles is this scares me a bit, but it's also kind of useful, is that you can override things from other classes. So the way that this works is that every class automatically has a tag that is the class name. So I don't know if you knew this. I certainly didn't. But yeah, you can include a class and then go and mess with all the files that class has given you. There you go. It's pretty scary, but totally useful, and the place to use it is in profile modules. That's the one place that's valid, because you include something, you override it, and you're done. You definitely don't start overriding this module over here, because that way lies madness. Okay, and I think that I'm about done. Did I mention that we're hiring? Of course. And yeah, I will throw the slides up. There are a bunch of notes. Most of the notes are actually just links to reference material, so you can learn more about what I'm talking about. And that's it. Any questions? Complete silence. Yeah.
One thing regarding the HTTP. If I have a server and client stuff,
Yeah.
well, should I really put something like that in the HTTP or?
Yes. I mean,
Thomas,
no,
Thomas,
either.
sorry, please repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, if I have an init.p, or if I have a module that both manages a server and a client, should I really use an init.pp? And I would say yes. And if that offends you, make an whatever it is underscore server module and a whatever it is underscore client module. But the way, I mean, I'd either do that, make 2 separate modules. If you really want to manage them separately, they shouldn't be in the same module. Full stop. If you really want to manage them as the same thing, well, just pick a default. You know, pick a default like, by default, I will include the server but not the client. That's what I do with mcollective, for example, and it's what the Puppet Labs mcollective module does. If you just say include mcollective, you'll get the server but not the client by default, but you can override that. Any more questions?
What is the right way to make a profile lookup?
Sorry, what's the right way to make a profile?
We started with roles and profiles and worked in profile slash profile fact I will look up, but this can work because profile is used for us as fact, and we can do a fact lookup like an array.
I'm not sure what you're actually asking. I'm sorry.
For example, I have a role web server,
Mm-hmm.
which has a profile, a space profile,
Mm-hmm.
and an Apache profile,
Yep.
and an Apache application profile. And I want for Apache application profile a special feature, a special parameter. How can I do an error lookup with this?
So to try and restate the question, the question was, if I have roles and profiles, I have like an Apache profile and I want to do something custom in the Apache profile, I would just put the hero data under profile : Apache. I mean, when you do roles and profiles, you can kind of end up with this module role and module profile that ends up kind of a mess. And in fact, roles and profiles are the only 2 cases where init.pp, nope. So they break my golden rule. But I'm kind of fine with that because they're both two kind of well-known higher-level abstractions. I mean, all these rules are made to be broken when you have a good reason. The entire point is to do something standard so it's not confusing most of the time.
So how do you manage the user? Okay, so you told you've got an application module and you don't want the user being defined in that module, so how do you do it?
Generally, I would probably encourage you to ship operating system packages that set up the user rather than doing it in Puppet. And I mean, most operating system packages will already do that. If you install Apache, you'll get a WoA data user, for example. If you need to do something more complicated than that, and the answer is probably you want a users module with your users, and you then pull in the right user in the profile on top of your code, and you can add ordering arrows such that you make the user, and then, in your own code, well, if you put users in it, you'll probably hurt yourself. If you ship anything to the Forge with a user in it, I'll probably hurt you. If I try and use it. And by hurt you, I mean cry on you.
What's the main advantage of putting the hero data files into the modules path?
The main advantage is that you can ship the main advantage when most people are running 3.3 will be that you can ship modules to the Forge with hero data. Because at the moment, the only real option you've got if you're shipping modules to the Forge is to put all the data in a params.pp class, and that offends me, basically. What's the release status of the 3.3 series? It's definitely in the do not ship a module to the Forge that uses this point. I mean, I'm using it in my home Puppet code. It's going quite well. It hasn't hurt me yet. But also, for my home stuff, I only manage, a couple of laptops and a home server and one co-located box. So even if it all explodes, it's not too big a deal for me. If I had the opportunity, if we got to the point where I could use this in work code, I would be working out how stable it is much faster. I mean, it's definitely coming. It is going to be a definite stable feature. And I think that we should be thinking about how we design things in light of the fact that data in modules is going to be a stable feature in the next major release of Puppet that we see. So, when we're back here in 12 months' time, half the room, I'll be going 2.7 upgrade, 3, half the room, 3.4, 3.3, 3.4 will be half the room, I would guess, in 12 to 18 months. So should be thinking about it now, because it's going to be important to people soon. Hey.
Hira 1.3 allows us to do Hira lookbooks from within Hira and also scope lookups. Is that something that you would to use?
Please repeat.
So the question was that the new versions of Hira allow you to do recursive lookups, right? So inside a Hira value, you can do another Hira lookup. And I would encourage you to do that if you need to. If you have a case where that's the only sane way you can think of solving it, and your situation is that complex, well, sure. I would try and work out if I'm doing something crazy first. I would certainly suspect that I'm probably doing something crazy if I needed that. And sure, sometimes you have to do crazy things because you have really complicated things. But it would definitely be cause for a pause for me. Not necessarily concern, but I'd have to stop and think to not be concerned. Yo.
Speaking about modules, is there best practice for publishing acceptance testing or integration testing for modules after?
That is a good question. So the question was, is there a well-known way of doing acceptance and/or integration testing for modules. So I assume you mean not Puppet RSpec, because Puppet RSpec is unit tests for modules. Above that, the thing that most people seem to be doing is there's a thing called server spec, which will do some integration, or it actually runs Puppet on your code rather than just simulating what the catalog would look like. But there isn't a very well-known way of doing full integration testing, certainly. The way that I've done this previously is to just rebuild an entire infrastructure. You know, throw up a 14 machine stack with 2 database servers, 2 web servers, 2 load balancers, etc. Install a real application in it, run the application's end-to-end tests, because unfortunately, the halting problem. You know, the halting problem implies that you don't know if any code change anywhere in your Puppet code or anywhere in your application code is actually going to fly until you run the code. Although that sort of testing is kind of expensive, and you need to be somewhere that has a hell of a lot of automation to be able to throw up a 14-machine stack for tests. That should be something that I think everybody should be trying to go towards. It would be better to have it would be good to have a better in-between solution than that, though. And whilst people are using server spec, I'm not sure that goes as far as you want. It certainly doesn't quite go as far as I want for integration testing. But this is still an area that people are experimenting with a lot. If you're interested in that stuff, my PuppetConf talk from this year was all about doing automated testing across entire infrastructures. There's a video online, check it out. Any more questions? I think we're pretty much out of time anyway.
One last question. Okay, no. Oh, sorry. Okay, no. So we have a break of 1 hour for lunch, and we'll see us back with a presentation about Razor.